Question. Why does the Creator favor fallen beings over elementals and embodiment, original inhabitants of this planet and avatars? This question stems from the obvious inadequacies of free will as experienced on this unnatural planet. For example, fallen beings continue to enjoy the protections of free will purposely placed into creation by the creators at the detriment of all other life streams. They can and do whatever they wish without sufficient punishment or discipline in this or consecutive lifetimes. All other beings are subject to their free will, even innocence. This is a flawed system from the beginning because it only perpetuates the fallen states. If fallen beings do not immediately experience the full measure of what they project out and do in real time, how is justice served? How do younger, more innocent life streams experience real justice? Without these and other checks and balances placed into creation, how do the victims of the fallen beings not become radicalized due to not seeing or experiencing true karmic justice in real time? This very primitive and flawed system only creates new fallen beings. Perhaps what we are currently experiencing is a very early version of free will 1.0. I do not care who answers this, but I do need an answer. Well, it's obviously a question that touches on many things that will be difficult to cover in just one answer, but I have already covered it in many of my other videos, including some of the videos in my series about how the world works. So there is actually quite a bit of material there, but I'll just give a certain summary and pull things together here. So in order to really understand the question, you have to have watched my video on how the world was created, because it talks about what fallen beings are and why they came to Earth and why they are allowed to be here. So in order to avoid giving too long of an answer to this, I'm going to refer to that video and say if you want to understand this, you need to watch that video. So I'll build on what's said in the video. So the idea is that we are living in an undescended sphere where nothing is permanent. In contrast to this, there's the ascended realm where there are beings who have become permanent beings. They have become ascended masters. Permanent doesn't mean that they're not growing. They are still growing. But they have become permanent because they have given up the desire to use our free will as separate beings. I explain in many videos we have two basic choices of free will. We can see ourselves as connected beings, connected to our higher selves and the ascended masters that reach all the way to the Creator, or we can go into the illusion that we are separate beings. And because we are in an unascended sphere where nothing can become permanent, free will is allowed to work itself out, which means that beings can go into the illusion of separation and they can continue to build onto this separate self that they create until they can't stand it anymore, until I've had enough of it. And so the question here, I mean, it's a very understandable question. I used to think this way when I was younger myself, but it was simply because I didn't quite grasp what free will really is. So it says here, fallen beings continue to enjoy the protections of free will. They actually don't enjoy the protections of free will. And I understand that it's talking about, it's a flawed system because people don't get, the fallen beings don't get immediate feedback on what they're doing. So let's say you're killing another human being, but there's not a flash of lightning from above that instantly kills you because you killed somebody else. And this is what the questioner means, I assume. So the questioner is really saying that if there was to be justice, if it was a just system, we could use our free will to kill somebody else, but we should instantly be killed when we do so. The problem with that is that it's not understanding what free will really is about, or what the unascended sphere is about. Because this is an unascended sphere. The purpose of the unascended sphere is to help us have certain experiences of exercising our free will until we have had enough of these experiences. The purpose of this world is not to manifest specific physical conditions. That took me a long time to resolve this. It took me a long time to see this. It's not about the physical conditions. They're secondary. The entire purpose of the world, the unascended sphere, is what happens in people's consciousness. In other words, the experiences we are having. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the questioner hasn't understood, and I understand this because it took me many years, as I said, to understand this, but the questioner hasn't understood that there is actually instant feedback. It's just not physical feedback. You see, the questioner is saying, if a fallen being kills somebody else, that fallen being should be instantly killed, and that would teach the fallen being a lesson. But would it necessarily? You see, in order to kill another human being, you have to go into a specific state of mind. And then when you kill that other human being, that state of mind is reinforced. That means your experience is now magnified. Your sense of self shifts when you have done something that violates another human being's free will, whether it's killing them or something else. You are more anchored in that separate self that you have. And this is instant feedback. It is also instant justice. It's just that what has been allowed to happen is that there is a delay factor between your state of mind and the physical circumstances that this state of mind precipitates. And this is actually a grace to help you, give you an opportunity to work on your state of mind until the physical karma comes back. So in other words, you kill somebody in one lifetime. Seems like you get away with it because you're not instantly killed and society doesn't catch you and put you in jail. But the karmic impulse starts working out through the 4 levels of the material universe, and in a future lifetime it will come back. And when it comes back to the physical, you will be killed because you will experience that. So this means you now have several lifetimes where you can change that state of consciousness. And if you transcend that state of consciousness that caused you to kill the person, you will not have to be killed in that future lifetime because the karma won't have to become physical. But if you don't transcend that state of consciousness, what does that mean? It means you are now living in that state of consciousness for all of those lifetimes. And it's becoming more and more intense because, if you're not deliberately transcending a state of consciousness, it will become magnified. It will become more and more solidified. So that means, if you are in a state of consciousness where you are willing to kill another human being, you are suffering. You are suffering in that state of consciousness. And if you don't change your state of consciousness, your suffering becomes more intense. Now, the questioner is not quite grasping, which is probably a good thing, the fallen beings and their state of consciousness. Because it may seem like fallen beings are very powerful beings, like Hitler or Stalin or Mao were very powerful beings. But their suffering was beyond what most people can even imagine. They were constantly suffering because they were constantly feeling threatened. They were constantly trying to get, the whole universe to comply with their worldview. And it was just intense agony on the inner. So, you could say, if you want to be a little bit dramatic, you could say that if somebody kills another human being and lightning strikes and you're killed instantly, yeah, that's a certain form of punishment. But living in the same state of consciousness and it becoming more and more intense is a much worse form of punishment. So in a sense, you could say that the fallen beings are being punished. I mean, I'm not saying that God or the Ascended Master wants to punish anybody, but I'm just saying that fallen beings are punishing themselves. And they're in a, what I would consider an unbearable state of consciousness. I don't think I really can fathom it, but I can sense how intense their state of consciousness is and how they're constantly having to, they're in such a state of tension to try to uphold their view on themselves. That is an unimaginable punishment, and so if fallen beings do not immediately experience the full measure of what they project out in real time, how is justice served? But you see, they are experiencing the full measure of what they project out. Because how could they project it out if they weren't experiencing it? What they are projecting out is a result of their internal state of consciousness, and they are constantly experiencing that state of consciousness. So there is instant justice, instant return. But now we have to take this to another level, because I explain in my video about how the world was created and other videos in that playlist, is that the fallen beings were only allowed to come to Earth because the inhabitants of the Earth had already used their free will to create a downward spiral that would have led to the destruction of the Earth. So you see, it's not correct to say that younger or more innocent life streams do not experience real justice, because the fallen beings are allowed to do whatever they want, and this perpetuates fallen beings. It creates more fallen beings because people are traumatized by what the fallen beings do. But you see, younger and experienced life streams were not on Earth when the fallen beings were allowed to embody here. There were only life streams who had already used their free will to create the downward spiral. So you see that it's not that the Ascended Masters allowed fallen beings to embody on a natural planet. That wouldn't be allowed. But the Earth had already gone below the level of the natural planet, and that's why the fallen beings were allowed to embody here. That's what I explained in the other video. They were a substitute teacher. And they were meant to break up this very uniform mindset that the inhabitants of the Earth had at the time. So you see what I'm saying? There is two levels of free will that need to be considered here. There is, yes, the fallen beings have free will, and they can do whatever they want, and they are often violating other people. They are constantly violating other people, you could say. But the inhabitants of the Earth, when the fallen beings were allowed to embody here, they also had their free will. And they had used their free will to create a condition on Earth where fallen beings could be allowed to embody here. And the Earth is not actually perpetuating or creating more fallen beings in the sense that it is up to the inhabitants of the Earth to decide when fallen beings will no longer be allowed to embody here. And if you look at Earth, you will see that the Earth is actually, and has for a long time, been in an upward spiral, where fallen beings have less and less influence on the planet. And one way to see this is democracy. Fallen beings do not want democracy. They want a dictatorship where they're the dictator. But the fact that we have democracy shows you that the collective consciousness on Earth has been gradually raised. That's why democracies could manifest. Now you could say that right now the fallen beings are engaged in a last-ditch effort to undermine democracy, to try to get these last dictatorships to challenge democracy. But that will eventually be ground into dust by the wheels of history. And so what I'm trying to say is that the question, it's a very understandable question, but it misunderstands the equation that fallen beings are only allowed on a planet when the inhabitants of that planet have already created a downward spiral. Now you can say there's a special case with avatars who came from natural planets and therefore were in a certain sense innocents. But we knew what we had at least some sense of what we were going to experience here on Earth. So we had decided to use our free will to say, yes, we are willing to embody here, even though we know conditions are not ideal and there are fallen beings here. So we chose this. Again, everything is a result of choices. And I understand the question very well. As I said, I probably could have asked a similar question 30 years ago. But I also see today that it's because I didn't grasp the fullness of free will. And I didn't grasp that in the duality consciousness, as I've explained, what created the downward spiral on Earth was that most inhabitants went into the illusion of separation. They used the duality consciousness to create all these ideologies, worldviews, religions that said this is the only right way. And in the duality consciousness, we forget that we made the choice to go into duality. You were not forced to go into duality. The fallen beings couldn't force you to go into duality. When you are in duality, they can manipulate you. But they can't really force you to go into duality. You have to make a choice. Now, you may not be fully aware of what the choice entails. As I said, you can, without being fully aware, you can choose to go into duality, but in order to get out of duality, you have to become aware of the choices you made and consciously reverse them. But so understand that once you go into duality, you are projecting. This wasn't a result of choices you made. It just happened. The fallen beings forced me to do this. They did this to me. And therefore you can also say that, you can say as this is a very primitive and flawed system, only creates new fallen beings. Perhaps what we are currently experiencing is a very early version of free will 1.0. But it's not. We are looking at the situation on Earth from inside duality and separation. And therefore we don't see how it works. And that's why we think we are victims of the fallen beings, we are victims of God, we are victims of the Ascended Masters deciding to allow fallen beings to come to Earth. We are just victims. But you see, it's precisely that attitude, that belief, that keeps the fallen beings on Earth. Because what will cause the fallen beings to be removed from Earth is that a critical mass of the original inhabitants of the Earth decide to take back responsibility that they are the ones who are deciding the fate of the planet, whether the planet is going up or down. And it's when they decide to raise their consciousness, that's when, and as I said, many people have already done this, that's why the planet is in an upward spiral. And that's what will cause the fallen beings to gradually, more and more of them, one at a time, being taken off the planet. And that will cause the Earth to rise. But you see, the victim consciousness that, oh, this is a wrong system, it shouldn't be that way, the fallen beings should be dealt with this way and that way, this is what keeps them here, because people are not taking responsibility and realizing the fallen beings can really only affect us through the choices we make. And therefore we can, at any time, free ourselves from our past choices so that the fallen beings will not have any influence on us. And this is what the teachings of the Ascended Masters are all about, giving us the teachings and the tools to free ourselves from the influence of the fallen beings, which also helps us raise ourselves on the spiritual path towards the 144th level of consciousness. So it's a opportunity for us to grow individually and to help the planet grow collectively. So, you know, I'm not in any way justifying what the fallen beings are doing on the planet. I'm just trying to say that when you understand the equation of free will, you understand that it was the choices of the original inhabitants of the earth that caused the fallen beings to be allowed to embody here. And it's only the choices of these original inhabitants that will cause them to be taken away from here. Because right now they are a kind of substitute teacher. What is Vladimir Putin doing to the Russian people? He's giving them an opportunity to learn the lesson they haven't learned in the past by finally coming to a point where they're willing to take responsibility for themselves instead of wanting a leader who makes decisions for them. How bad is it going to have to be before they will take that responsibility? Well, I can't answer that question. What did Hitler do for the German people? And for many other people? He gave them an opportunity to decide, we don't want this kind of leader anymore. And there was a shift in Western Europe after the Second World War, when not only the German people, but many people decided, I'm not saying they knew this consciously, but they basically decided, we do not want this kind of dictator to lead our country anymore. And unfortunately, this is what the Ascended Masters call the School of Hard Knocks, where you have that we can learn by receiving teachings and impulses from above, from the spiritual realm, from the Ascended Masters. And if we are not willing to do that by going into separation, in separation we learn through the School of Hard Knocks. But the hard knocks is not a matter of the outer things that happen. It's a matter of the experiences, the inner experience we're having, our sense of self. And that's why I'm saying there is an instant return of whatever you project out. And it's your state of consciousness. And you see, when you are in a certain state of consciousness, let's go back to the simple example. In order to come to a point where you're willing to kill another human being, you have to get yourself into a certain state of consciousness. And that reaches a certain level of intensity. But you can think about killing other people, you can be willing to kill other people without doing it. What happens when you actually do it? When you cross that line and now you do it? Well, all of a sudden you are solidifying, you are intensifying your state of consciousness. And that means you have a worse experience after you killed somebody than you had before. And you are going to be living in that state of consciousness, in that prison, in that penal colony in your own mind, where you're constantly punishing yourself. You're going to be doing this until you take responsibility for yourself and consciously change your state of mind. I don't know what worse punishment you can imagine. I mean, if you want to talk about punishment, well, I'm not really big on punishment, but if you want to talk about punishing the fallen beings, there's no worse punishment I can imagine for them than them being in the state of consciousness they're in. They are constantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, experiencing themselves through that state of consciousness. I don't really see what could be worse. Especially when you reach a level of consciousness where you're free of the ego and this dualistic ego and a dualistic state of consciousness, you realize how bad of a punishment that is. But again, you know, God does not look at life. The Ascended Masters do not look at this in terms of punishment. That's again from the dualistic mindset. But the Ascended Masters are looking at raising consciousness and how can they help beings raise consciousness. And when you log into that, then you can make peace, understand the questions that are being raised, but you can make peace with it when you log into that.